Hello and welcome to our webinar today. I'm John Tolbert from KuppingerCole, and supporting the webinar today we have iWelcome, and Corne Van Roy is here with us today to talk about consumer identity and access management. And we're going to hear a case study for GDPR compliance. But before we begin, a little bit about us. KuppingerCole was founded in 2004. We're an independent analyst firm with offices around the globe. We offer neutral advice and technical expertise, thought leadership in the subjects listed below. We support end-user organizations of all kinds, system integrators, software vendors. We specialize in information security, cybersecurity, and identity management and governance and GRC topics. We have three major business areas. We do research on those topics that we just mentioned, and we can tailor that to your individual needs. We try to provide vendor neutral advice so we can be objective and stay up to date with all the latest information about products and services. We also have events such as conferences and webinars like this, where we try to provide innovative leadership and a future-proof approach. Our conferences are good opportunities to network with other people and meet the experts. We also do advisory services. We're a trusted advisory partner for many organizations, and we give the most up-to-date advice on all areas around the digital transformation. Speaking of events, we just had our first Consumer Identity World event in Seattle a couple of weeks ago, and the next one is upcoming in Amsterdam at the end of October, and then after that, Singapore, November 20th through 22nd. And then following that, we have two events, the Cyber Security Leadership Summit and the Cyber Access Summit, both in Berlin, November 12th through the 14th. So we hope you can join us at those events. Today we'll have some handouts that you can download through the GoToWebinar control panel. iWelcome has provided a white paper and a consent lifecycle management profile, as well as a case study. And then we'll also have a poll with some questions from iWelcome near the end of the webinar. So about the webinar itself, everyone is muted. You don't have to mute or unmute yourself. We'll take care of that. We're recording the webinar, and we will have the recording available by tomorrow. And we will have a question and answer session at the end. You'll find a box in the GoToWebinar control panel where you can enter your questions, and you can do that anytime during the presentation here, and then we will take those questions at the end. So I'll start off and talk about consumer identity and access management at a high level, talk about the features and the market trends and what the business drivers are, and then I'll turn it over to Corne, and then we'll do the Q&A. So as I mentioned, we had our Consumer Identity World Conference a couple of weeks ago here in Seattle, and one of the questions that keeps coming up is around what does the C and CIAM stand for? And there's a bit of nuance between consumer versus customer, but another topic that floated up from the crowd was around these solutions also apply to citizens. So let's say that the C and CIAM can stand for either consumer, meaning end user, customer, which in some cases might be business to business, and then also citizen. So I thought we'd start with a little look at what are the differences between IAM and consumer IAM. So IAM in the olden days, or even today, has mostly been about employee-facing use cases, whereas CIAM is consumer, customer, and in some cases citizen-facing. The authentication methods that IAM systems have grown to support over the last couple of decades are things like Kerberos or smart cards, maybe USB keys or other kinds of tokens, in addition to username and password. But it's, for the most part, a lighter experience on the consumer side, where it's still mostly username, password, sometimes the use of social logins or mobile authentication applications or mobile push notifications. We collect attributes in IAM for authorizing people to get access to information, whereas in consumer identity, we collect attributes to know more about the consumers, both in the financial regulation sense and then also in the sense to be able to do better marketing to them. We collect that information and store it in LDAP or SQL databases in some instances for enterprise IAM. But on the consumer side, it can be LDAP, SQL, or because we also collect unstructured information, such as in some cases audio or video, that may go into a MongoDB or some other big data application. For single sign-on on the enterprise side, we've been using SAML for about the last 15 years, a slightly more heavyweight version than what we find on the consumer side, which is OAuth and OIDC. And as we learned in the last few days, there can be problems with security if you don't implement those correctly. And then one of the driving forces on enterprise IAM is access control. And one of the things we have to be very concerned about on the consumer side is privacy. If we look at the characteristics in more detail on consumer identity systems, we see that rather than collecting all the information up front like we do from an employee, HR does, and then enter that into the database, we have to sort of progressively get more information from consumers. So we offer companies offer self-registration and sometimes the use of social logins, and then collect information over time, like user activities, what have they purchased, what have they liked on social media. This provides a more well-rounded view of customer preferences, as well as being able to collect their consent. In this sense, we get consumer identity sort of feeding CRM systems and then even marketing and marketing automation systems with more accurate information. We've talked about things like bring your own device in the past, which is definitely a reality in the consumer side, but also bringing your own identity too. And that's where we use existing email accounts or existing OpenID accounts, as well as users' phones for the basis for identity. And consumers generally have an expectation of having an omni-channel experience, meaning they can have the same or similar experience whether they're using their phone, a tablet, or a full desktop browser solution. Things should pretty much work the same between all the different kinds of platforms, as well as IoT, smart home, and connected consumer devices. And then whereas enterprise IAM can scale to hundreds of thousands, in many cases, consumer identity systems need to scale to billions of identities. And here's a little look at some of the kinds of data that consumer identity management systems can collect with consent. I like to break it into two categories: identity analytics versus marketing analytics. On the identity analytics side, there can be information around the number of registrations from consumers you receive over a given time period, how many of those are incomplete or abandoned. You can also get reports on, how many logins per user and then also per time period, how many of the login attempts are failed, how many profile edits, how many password resets. It's really more of the mechanical elements of the identity management system that we're looking at when we think about identity analytics. Things that can also be used to sort of feed the security intelligence and security incident and event management solutions. On the marketing side, many companies are interested in getting demographics: age, gender, where's the user at, what have they been looking for, what kinds of things have they purchased, and if possible to tie that to relevant social media activities. But consent is really the key here. Consumer identity can make the user's experience much better, but in the days of GDPR here, we need to be able to tell users, what are you going to do with the data that I give you? And then consumers want to know, what do I get out of it? And in many cases, they're looking for some sort of reward for granting consent to their information. This can be things like discounts, information that they can use in their experience. But you really have to get the balance right. One of the key concepts that we talk about with relation to consumer identity is, trying to provide as frictionless an experience as possible for them. So the less data that you collect through a consumer identity and access management solution, the better experience they may have, at least initially, because it's less friction. But you do have to collect some data. So as you are moving through the user journey, there's a moderate amount of data that can be collected that generates some friction. And then there are times when you do have to collect a lot of data, and that might be considered high friction from the user perspective. So trying to get the balance right for the use case is an important consideration. So we can use consumer identity solutions for KYC applications, or know your customer. And the different attributes I listed a few minutes ago, that's a lot of data that can be generated, collected, analyzed. From the company or the organization that's deploying that perspective, you can use that information for a number of different purposes, including improving the overall user experience. You can really see, what do your consumers like and what do they dislike? What are the things that they're looking at? What are the things that they tend to ignore? And you can use that information to decide how you want to develop and extend your site, or what to sort of turn off because it's not really getting the attention from consumers. You can also use the information to tailor marketing campaigns to specific groups of users. You can offer discounts for customers or consumers that buy a lot or buy frequently on your site. Or maybe they've been on your site many times and they haven't bought anything, and you want to entice them to buy something. If you're collecting this information, then you can offer those kinds of users discounts in a retail setting. It can also be used to enhance your brand loyalty and produce higher quality leads, which ultimately should lead to higher revenues. So in this sense, consumer identity management solutions can be a part of a revenue generating business unit. Many times in the IT world, identity management specialists are often told, we're part of a cost center, we're overhead, but consumer identity can help IT shops become part of the overall revenue stream. So I wanted to look at, for a minute here, what some of the regulatory drivers are. So in addition to collecting information about consumers and using that for marketing, regulations such as GDPR require the collection of consent for the use of information, and consumer identity management solutions can help facilitate that as they are designed to pop up screens and make sure that the end users understand what their data is being used for, and give them some control too. So it's really important to have an identity or a consumer identity management solution that can facilitate that. We also, in the US, are now beginning to see an increased interest in privacy at the state level. So we see the California consumer privacy law that's going to be coming into effect. There's also regulations such as PSD2 in Europe. PSD2 is a financial regulation. The text of the regulation went into effect in January, and then testing for the regulatory technical specifications begins in March of next year, with an overall implementation date of September of next year. PSD2 essentially mandates a couple of very interesting things from which consumer identity management solutions can help banks in particular. One is strong customer authentication, and then banks have to offer APIs to third-party providers, and consumer identity can help with the strong customer authentication, plus providing a bit of a competitive advantage in terms of collecting information about the user to make their overall experience when they're conducting financial transactions online better. Then we also have things like PCI, payment cards, and then on the financial side also there's the strict financial KYC, know your customer, as well as the anti-money laundering laws in different jurisdictions that have to be complied with. And things like AML, KYC mandate the collection of information about users. It's not necessarily at odds with GDPR and the need to collect consent. So a little bit more on GDPR. By default, privacy has to be sort of built into applications now for applications that face European consumers in this case. So that means companies have to allow their consumers to opt in, not opt out, which had previously been the paradigm in many locations around the world. So you have to collect consent and keep a history of that consent, and then be able to provide notifications to users, let's say the 72-hour data breach notification rule. Customers also have the right to ask for their information about which you're storing to be exported so they can take it with them and to another service provider. And they also have the right to request that you delete the information that you're carrying about them. And again, consumer identity management solutions, the well-designed ones have the capabilities to do this already. PSD2, as I was mentioning, strong customer authentication. They define that in pretty much the standard way, whether it's a combination of something you have, something you are, or something you know. So there are a multitude, really, of different kinds of authenticators that can be used, including, a pretty heavy emphasis these days on mobile authentication technologies such as mobile push, applications that are specially designed for mobile authentication. They also have to do transactional risk analysis. This is another place where CIAM can come into play. Some of the sophisticated CIAM solutions, contain the history so that it's easier to do a comparison between current and past transaction requests. Again, there's the need to do know your customer and anti-money laundering. And we believe that banks that have mature consumer identity management solutions will have a competitive advantage because they can provide a better user experience, which will help them keep their customers as competition from these new third-party providers increases across Europe. So real quickly, we've got 20 different functional selection criteria that we believe that end user organizations should look at when looking for a consumer identity management solution. There's the ability to do the self-registration or bulk import of users. That's pretty common. Most every one of the CIAM solutions can do that. Consent mechanisms, as you can see, it's an important consideration. There is a lot of variability between the consumer IAM solutions out there, so if you're doing business in Europe, look for the ones that have the best offerings in this area. User dashboards, users should be able to come in and look at what they've given consent to and change it. Also to delete or export their profile from the dashboard. You should be able to trigger automatic privacy policy change notifications from your CIAM solution. You should also think about scalability. How many users do you anticipate? Does the solution provider able to scale up that far? White labeling, seamless branding. Again, most of the CIAM vendors can do that today. Make sure they have the choice of authenticators that you want to be able to offer your consumer base. And they should also be able to process social logins. Most do that. Most are able to do OpenID or OIDC. A risk engine is something that you might want to consider, especially if you've got the need for higher assurance authentication, which can be used for risk adaptive authentication, step up. You can also, in many cases, import fraud intelligence or compromised credential intelligence. Think of that as like the have I been pwned. You know, you want to make sure that you're processing valid logins from consumers. Then there's also the concept of storing the user information in a profile. You know, what kinds of information can be stored there. And the need to do single sign-on across multiple web properties. There's the two different kinds of analytics, both identity and marketing, which can be used to drive marketing automation. Then you should also think about if you have an existing CRM solution, how well does the CIAM solution you're considering integrate with that? And then smart homes and other consumer facing devices and IoT need to be integrated with consumer identity. So the connecting of device identities with consumer user identities is an important consideration too. And then lastly, we see some divergence in the CIAM solutions, which is really driven by the different kinds of markets that the CIAM vendors are going after. So the retail, for instance, you know, may have lower assurance authentication requirements, and you know, their output, it needs to be more on the marketing side, whereas you know, healthcare, finance probably needs higher assurance authentication choices. So that leads to differences in the implementations in the different kinds of solutions that you see in the CIAM market. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Corné.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. As introduced already, my name is Corné van Rooij, and I run product at iWelcome. In this part of the webinar, I will present how organizations are adapting themselves towards a more customer-centric business, taking into account the GDPR, as mentioned yet, and how this affects the role CIAM systems as ours play. First, a short intro of ourselves. iWelcome is the European customer or consumer identity and access management player, and we are a full SaaS solution. So we are 100% in the cloud. Our customers' data stays within Europe and can even stay within the country. And we also support enterprise IAM cases with our platform, but for this specific webinar, I will not touch on that. The main task of our CIAM platform is to connect people with our customers' business, which can be fully digital platforms as well as IoT devices. We create that seamless single sign-on feeling customers expect nowadays, offer that 24/7 and protect the data of these customers, both security as privacy-wise. Which organization is not in digital transformation nowadays? Certainly the leaders and large organizations that focus on consumers cannot stay behind. That transformation is a continuous process. It starts strategically first, then the IT and the software platforms start to play a role. But an integral part of that transformation is also the way you do business with your customers and how they perceive that, good or bad, with friction or smooth. Customers nowadays are only one click away from your competition. A decision as such is very easily executed in the digital world. It's just one click. So you need to take care about your customers, even more than ever before. With the GDPR, consumers got rights, or better said, they already had those rights, but they needed to be enforced better. Specifically when the customer or consumer becomes known, so that moment you are storing personal information like name or its address into your system, that moment you start managing these consumers or customers. So known, you are confronted with a large set of GDPR requirements to fulfill. I think most people in this webinar are aware of these, and most of these points were already mentioned by John. For sure, if done incorrect, these initial things like consent create friction instead of remove it. And if you don't use consent, you will have less data to know your customer about and to do nice marketing campaigns, discounting, site personalization, etc. So this part, going from pseudonymous to known, is not only a big effort, but it also creates or can be creating friction. What is clear is that consumers are moving more towards the center, where you have to attract, convert, and enrich them to create a long-lasting relationship, and that are now in control of their data. They are even allowed to withdraw their data and to have it corrected when it's wrong in your systems. Putting that consumer, that identity, in the center, you will see there are new things arriving. We already have personal data, you see that on the left, that you need to data protect. But preference management has become more important as opt-in is becoming the enforced standard, both from the GDPR as well as the new e-privacy regulation that will likely be approved by the EU first half next year. And then the number one of new things on the block is consent and all its facets like cycle management, life cycle management, and the fact that you have to change, be able to change your consent, extend it or withdraw it. With consent, it is important to realize that you cannot hide this in your privacy policy and terms of service. Like we can use your birthday to profile you on our book-selling website. It's forbidden as you make that use mandatory, while you don't need it to sell that book. And because you made it mandatory, they have the right, the birthday, they have to give the birthday to make use of your service, which makes the date birthday not freely given. So that violates this, what you see in the screen, the GDPR, the rule around freely given. So you need consent management if you want more data of your consumers that you minimally need to provide the service. And that consent needs to be asked in an informed way. You have to be explicit in what you will do with the data and exactly what. And you have to sell it, as by default, the answer is no, as it's opt-in. So you need to tell what the reward or benefit for the consumer is to share that additional data. And that is an agreement, which of course you need to store and you need to prove that you have it. And the consumer should be able to withdraw it as simple as they gave it. So how do you do that? Well, first of all, in every CIAM system, you have this golden record you see in the middle, the yellow bar, where all the attributes are stored that you collect during the customer journey, so to say. To store specific consent on the date of birth, you have to store that as part of that date of birth or in a separate data source. We choose to put that in the metadata of the date of birth and to make it multi-value. So you can have multiple consents on the date of birth. For instance, to profile the web page of that bookstore, to send them a discount check when his date of birth is, or to do something else with it. So we can record basically all these different consents. You also have the possibility to store a lot more metadata around it. So where the data came from, but also things like the expiration date or if it's confidential or not. So things like data retention can all be stored there. Then, of course, the UI gives you the possibility to view all that information, your consents, certain metadata. It will give you the capabilities of changing the data to receive a receipt of the consent and to request a certain consent. Then if you look at it, how it's connected, that central system has two ways of exposing. One is using just-in-time, so asking consent basically progressively. This is done during the customer journey. So when a customer starts registration, that's as part of the customer journey. Later buys a product, half year later buys another product. And then the whole time that the customer is basically engaged with you, you collect different consents, you collect different profile information, and you store that in that golden record and the metadata. Then for your digital platform, you have the possibilities on the top to have these digital platforms, which can be marketing clouds being provisioned, or you can have them push and pull that kind of information using webhooks. So that's basically the way the digital platform is connected. In this view, you see the different way consent can be captured. On the left side, it's doing the registration. That's interesting because you do not want to ask too much consent kind of thing. So you have to do it light, as it cannot be mandatory, because then it would not be a consent. But nevertheless, you have the ability to ask, for instance, for the birth date and state that what you're doing with that additional information. In the middle, you see a typical just-in-time consent. I will show you more examples later on. This pops up during the customer journey itself. So at the right moment, when you have value to add, you will ask that specific question. You will be clear what you will be doing with the data, for what purpose, and it's clear for them what they get back from it. On the right side, it's basically the self-service capabilities. Call it privacy dashboard or preferences dashboard, but it gives you the possibility to change the consent you are given, to change things like an email letter or the consent on birthday to send you a birthday card. Another thing that's important is transparency. Transparency on the data that you have collected in the way you're processing it, of course, but also transparency because they can correct data that is incorrect in your system, one of the GDPR rules. Creating transparency can also mean that if you click on, for instance, here, mobile phone number, on the right, you see that some of this information can be used from out of contract or maybe legitimate interest. So these are the grayed out ones you see in the middle. You cannot turn them off as a part of the contract. If you turn them off, basically, you would not be able to provide that service. As when it's mandatory, it needs to be the minimum use. The other ones you see on the bottom are specific ones that could be collected during any of the progressive consent or, sorry, just-in-time consent or during the registration process. And you will be able to turn them off later on, as easy as they were given. Good examples of just-in-time consent, I'll take just one of these examples, is Uber. If you know the Uber app, if you install it using the App Store, the Uber app itself will not ask for the GPS connection from the start you install it. It will let you first book a trip from A to B, and then the moment that you select the trip and say, please collect me, taxi driver, then at that moment, the Uber app will ask you for using the GPS information from your mobile phone. So they ask it at that time, and they return for it the simple value, as that it's easier than for the taxi driver to find you. So they return that value for getting your consent on using the GPS position. They likely, I haven't checked it lately, but they likely also say it will make it easier for you to input your start address. So if you look at consent, there are a couple of things that are important to have. First of all, you need to ask it at the right time, just-in-time consent, as the customer journey can take for years. And if you collect all the consents at the start, likely you create a very frictionless registration process. Second, need to be updated by any business application. So you need a consent API that is full feature. So your application should be able to request if there's consent, to write down the consent because it could be collected in that business application itself, to check that consent because it's a marketing tool and wants to know if they can send you an email letter. So there should be an API that is full feature that gives you that possibility. It also needs to travel with the data, because if you send that birthday, for instance, to a certain data store, then that specific application that's connected to that data store doesn't know what the limitations are of using that data. And that's not good. So it's better to have a way, and there are different ways of sending that information together with the metadata, together with the data itself. And you have to be fully transparent with consent. Like you saw in the interface I just showed, a user should be able to withdraw his consent and should be clear what that consent was, preferably also when it was given, but likely it's enough just to state what it is. Here we see how things fall together. At the top, all the records being profiled, including social media activities, consents, web analytics. In this case, I took Google Analytics, but of course there are many others. ERP and CRM have one and the same user ID, or they're connected user IDs. The web analytics system, of course, does not know who actually is behind that user ID. So it doesn't know the personal information, because you won't sharing that with Google on their cloud service. At least you should not. But if you bring all this profile data, login data, region, buying history, click behavior, interest on your website, so how they went through your website, and consumer customers history itself all together into a big data lake, you're basically collecting informed and consented identity analytics and marketing analytics data, as John mentioned, and it will all be in that big data lake. There's one advantage of that. It's a very powerful, it will create a very powerful know your customer view. You will know who to send that discount code, and even at what time, at his birthday, because things are all allowed or consented. You will have that strong customer-centric business build without breaking GDPR, without violating the e-privacy regulation, and even more important, without violating the privacy of your customers itself. And because you do care and take care and respect the customer's well-informed choices for that. And because you are then that trusted service, the customers is likely willing to share more data over time, to give you an even better insight, to provide them a better service, and as such improve that overall customer experience. But digital transformation will not stop here. We already see it at our customers. Relationships, permissions, mandates, interests, things, all will grow and will find their place into the next generation CIAM systems. This because relationship management as the whole communication with the customer itself has become fully digital 24/7. Think of giving your financial advisor the mandate to collect financial data from your banks and pension funds, or to give the postman the instructions to deliver a package at the neighbors, not the ones on number 24 because you don't like them, but the ones on 28. And you give that neighbor on number 28 the mandate to sign for you for that package, as it's valuable and it needs a signature. So things will change with consumer identity access management going forward, as more and more information where the consumer should be in control of, that our consumer choices, consumer interest, consumer data will all end up in that central system. And companies that want to survive in this new digital world need that single source of truth for their customer data. And consumers or customers need to have access all the time to that information. This is where CIAM lives, the source for consented personal identifiable information for both the consumers as well as your digital landscape. So how does that look? Well, on the top, you see the consumers having access to that identity information that is in the center, that single source of truth. Of course, there will only be consumer data accessible that is inputted by the consumer itself, but they will have full control of that, including its consent. Then there's a self-service interface where you click on the consent, remove them, change the preferences, attach IoT device, do two-factor authentication. So quite advanced user interfacing, privacy dashboarding, that is all there, all from the system. Then, of course, the different roles within the company itself, like the compliance officer, the customer care, marketing and sales department, all can have access to this data store. In our case, it's a big MongoDB data store, where all that information about the consumers and customers are collected. The consumers eventually, single sign-on will end up on the different likely siloed systems that are still in the landscape of the customers, and these siloed systems all connect to this central source of truth through API layers, so they'll all have one view of the customer. So this is how things are all connected and how the digital landscape is connected to that central source and how consumers can have access to their data. And that is my presentations. So if there are any questions, I think we'll do the poll first, isn't it, John? Yeah. So we have some poll questions people can answer. Nice tool in GoToWebinar. So we give some time for everybody to answer these questions if they like. And then at the end, we have a good overview of the organizations that were contributing or listening to this webinar and where they are and struggling or interested in.
So yeah, second question here, are you using data from digital systems, CIAM profiles, web analytics, behavior, and ERP to optimize marketing? Getting some responses. Okay, third question. Has your organization empowered the user to control its data, including all the needed consents?
This is basically a profile page where they can also see the data itself, where it's used for, and if there's any consent, and can withdraw the consent. Because this kind of information can be hidden in different applications.
We'll share the results.
Okay. A good 30% who mastered this. That's very good.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Really about this. Yeah.
I'd say roughly a third and a third. Maybe a little bit more on the not quite there. Let's see. Are you using the combined data for marketing and such? No, 36. Somewhat 36.
Yeah, you see that like two-thirds at least is or partly or using it or significantly using it. And this is also our view, that we see that it's more and more used, and the data is getting combined from all the different systems. And if they are put in a data lake, like in my example or in your example, they're all connected by each other because there's a strong, for instance, marketing cloud system. That's different, but it's all the same use basically.
Is CIAM the topic of IAM or digital marketing organization? Well, that's interesting too.
Yeah. See that the IAM is still dominant. Although you see more and more jointly ones. I think the jointly ones are the more successful. If it's completely owned by digital and marketing, you will see silos popping up again, which needs migration into the normal enterprise landscape. If it's an IAM only, likely it's not going to be very frictionless.
Yeah, you know, this kind of reflects what I've been seeing too, that there's more of a move. Well, you know, I guess at the beginning of CIAM, a lot of the initiative was taken by the marketing organization, and now we see more either being started by the IT IAM organization, or even better, when they work together on this. So I think, you know, there is that realization that IT identity management can become part of the revenue stream, you know, so I think there's a big benefit to IT organizations working with marketing to deploy these kinds of capabilities, not only for the company, but for the organization within the company that's responsible for it.
Exactly. Yeah. So shall we switch to the questions, because now we're still talking and talking, John. Let's switch it over.
Yeah, let's see. Okay. First question we have is, how would CIAM work together with a customer data platform?
A customer data platform. What's a customer data platform, John? Do you know?
Well, he's abbreviated it as CDP. I'm going to guess it must be different from CRM.
Yeah, probably one big master data set.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll address it from the CRM side. I think, you know, they can either export it as sort of common data formats that can be imported by CRM, or I think in, you know, in the more ideal use cases, there are ways for CIAM solution vendors to provide out-of-the-box connectors to various CRM or marketing automation platforms. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Corne?
Yeah, it also depends on what's the authoritative source in this case, because it could be that the CIAM system is later introduced and that the authoritative source was a previous system of storage of the consumer itself. But the CIAM system is introduced so the consumer gets control, or there are other things like single sign-on that are needed between the platforms. So the different stages could be different. Could start as that the master source feeds into the CIAM system and it stays the master source. It could be that there's a handover on what's trusted and who's able to make changes. So I think we see them in different ones, but normally they're connected with provisioning connectors, or what I just called in the more modern world, webhooks are becoming more and more known.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Okay. So next question we have, how can you measure friction or later on use that to reduce friction?
Yeah, that's a good one. If you look at the web analytics software I just showed as an example, the Google ones, you normally can see where people drop out. And of course, the CIAM system itself shows where in the registration flow, so where the CIAM system is still in the flow, it will be able to measure exactly every step. And you can also connect that with a Google Analytics system. So you have an end-to-end from the registration to any friction you have on your website. So there's a view on the CIAM system itself where you can measure the friction and see it's reduced. And you could go to one collected view. So put in some Google Analytics tags and get this information all the way up to the Google Analytics, and you see it in the whole basically customer interaction where people drop out or take longer, or yeah, just don't get it or drop out. Yeah. And of course, if you measure it, you can measure it later on when you've done some things that should be improving things.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, to be able to look at the overall customer experience flow and figure out where are the places where you are having people sort of abandon the process, and then figure out from there, what are the ways that we can make this easier? Do we need to collect this information at this point? I mean, depending on the use case, of course, there are certain points where you're going to have to collect more information than others, but is there a way to do it, a little bit more unobtrusively? So I think that's a really good point. Use the tools that are provided to examine the flow sort of from beginning to the known customer stage, and figure out where the places are you can make it easier for them. Okay, let's see. Next question is, if I collect at the start, would that mean I create less friction overall?
John, your opinion.
Well, probably. Well, I guess it depends. I mean, the world that we've lived in up to the GDPR point, people are often presented with a screen full of terms and conditions and privacy policies that, as we all know, no one actually reads. They just click accept and they go on. So probably not. I mean, I think if you can walk the user gently through the process, only take what information you need at the beginning to sort of create the account, and then, watch what they do. Get permission, get consent to watch what they do, but then, collect this information in such a way as it isn't burdensome to them to provide the information. What do you think?
Yeah, let's take the Uber example. If they ask the GPS connection from the moment that you install the application, it probably creates less friction, but the result was less people that said yes. So here it's a little bit of so it could be that you create less friction if you ask for that kind of permissions up front, but the question is if you then eventually create more value for your customers, because do they understand or can make the decision at that moment? You're basically getting all the questions about what the service can provide if you give more data at the start. It may reduce friction, but it's not going to give enough value for the customer. So I think it's a balance there. Friction is not everything here.
Yeah, you know, I like that example because just think about any of the apps that you deal with on a regular basis. If they seem like they ask for too much up front, I know I'm less likely to want to complete the install or complete the registration. So only get what you need at the beginning, and as you say, as you can deliver the value to the customer, they will, you know, have a much more positive experience, and then they'll probably be more willing to give up more information later, as long as they perceive that ongoing value and trust. You know, trust that they know that your company is going to use the information just for only the purposes that you've listed.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, let's see. Another one here. Why is there a difference between identity analytics and marketing analytics? It's all data about the consumer, right? Yeah, I mean, I'll start with that. Yeah, I think it is all data about the consumer, but I think it's the purposes and what you can do with the data afterward that sort of drive the distinction between the two. You know, like I said, on the identity analytics side, I think of that more for, you know, security, being able to feed security systems to look for patterns of fraud and try to reduce fraud. And then also sort of basic information that your site developers can use to know about incomplete registrations. Whereas on the marketing analytics side, it's about, you know, getting useful information to sort of understand what's in the mind of the consumer to be able to give them what they're looking for. How would you characterize that, Corné?
Yeah, I think the marketing side really gives you the view on who it is, and the other side gives you the view on what he's doing, because it's mostly event driven. When does he log in? Is he using its social registration or social login for that purpose? So it's event driven data. So it gives a lot more insight about what the consumer actually is doing and how often he's logging in and things like that, where the marketing side gives you a view of who the person himself is. So one is the profile, the other one is more like the transactions. And I think it's very difficult to put these two into one store. So that's maybe also why you see them all separately, and because they have different use cases, like you just mentioned. The fraud department will very likely look at the event information. If there's strange behavior there, if somebody is logging in at strange moments from strange regions, and he will not look at the profile information, exactly who it is, female, male, what age and what name, because that doesn't really, doesn't really matter for creating the fraud case. So the use cases are different, and the people looking at them are different. So that's likely why they don't put them all into one system. At least we're not putting them all into one system.
Well, you know, and that's a good point too. I mean, I think the different kinds of information can be stored separately, since they are being used for different purposes. And there are a couple of different approaches that the CIAM solution providers take to that. You can either try to build out the complete functionality for your customers, you know, which would include, you know, maybe having some predefined reports about identity analytics and marketing analytics. And, you know, on the CIAM solution provider side, you're building all the logic for that. You know, another approach is to say, you know, I'm guessing that my customers probably have big data applications and data visualization applications on their own. I'm going to collect and store all this information and expose it via an API. So, you know, people can, you know, use the existing tools that they have instead of having to, go into the CIAM tool to do that. So there's a couple of different ways to go about doing that. That was a good question. Any insights on that from your side?
No, only that we see the same thing, that there's less and less interest in diving into specific views or reports that our tool makes, and more interest of getting that data in the right bigger tools where they do all the analytics on anyway. So that's certainly a big trend. But
Yeah.
that's expected because of all the big data projects going on. That's the first thing that, well, eventually when they're doing all the ERP information and maybe some web analytics information, they will say, okay, we need more information. What do we have? Well, one very important source is, of course, the CIAM system then. So I think everybody could see that one coming.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, people are collecting information. They do have all sorts of data lakes and big data applications, analytics and visualization tools and things like that. And the data that they collect from CIAM systems is just one piece they want to analyze, perhaps against other data stores. So it makes sense that we kind of move to this API-centric world to process that data too. Okay.
Agree.
Well, final question in the blank is, will we get a copy of the recording? And the answer to that is, yeah, we'll provide a link that should go out either later today or tomorrow, and everyone who attended or registered will be able to get a copy of the recording that way.
Yeah, the recording and the tool presentation, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, there's handouts here. Yeah, let's not forget that. That's good too. There's handouts in the GoToWebinar control panel. If you click on the handouts button, you'll be able to download those PDFs as well. Okay.
Good.
Well, we've made it to the top of the hour. I wanted to thank everyone for attending, and thank you, Corné, for the great presentation.
Thank you, John, for the same.
And good discussion too. And thanks everyone for the questions as well. And with that, we will conclude today's webinar. And again, check back by tomorrow. We should have this available for you. And with that, have a good day.